I'm Ananya Roy, and I live in public housing. I'm an educator, a professor at the world's greatest public university, and I live in public housing. My career affords me a home in the rolling California hills with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge and that most robust of American traditions of democracy, a homeowners association. And still, I live in public housing. When I say public housing, it most likely conjures for you images of dilapidated towers with concentrated poverty. When I say public housing, it most likely conjures for you the dependency of the poor on welfare. But I can say that the home I live in is public housing because the tax deduction that my partner and I enjoy on our mortgage is a most substantial handout than any money spent by the US government on what has come to be stereotyped and vilified as public housing. And there are millions of other families that enjoy the same benefit. Let me give you just one statistic. In 1999, as the American century came to a close, the US government spent $24 billion on housing and rental subsidies for the poor. But in that same year, it gave away $72 billion, or 3 times as much, on home ownership subsidies for the middle classes and wealthy. I start with this example because it forces us to unknow poverty, to call into question the familiar frames through which we know poverty, especially the frames of dependency and welfare. Mortgage subsidies are just one of many welfare programs that enable prosperity in America. And there is no stigma attached to this dependency. Yet, in our popular understanding, it is the poor that we see as dependent, waiting to be saved through aid, charity, welfare. Why do we know poverty in this way? Why is our own dependency so unknown to us? And what are the implications of this for our contemporary times? I like to say that we live in an age of poverty. That of a world population of 7 billion, 2 billion currently live under the unimaginable conditions of poverty is now common sense. We know this fact. We throw it around in dinner conversations. But how do we know poverty? Let me share with you a clip from a recently released video that is part of a media and poverty action project that I lead at UC Berkeley, titled, "Can We Shop to End Poverty?" The video explores how we know poverty. Take a look. Here then is my first provocation, that in a global world, we do not see invisible workers. Instead, we see visible poverty. A child living in poverty flashes a brilliant smile. Sponsor a child today. Do the poor really smile this much? Here is my second provocation, that what we see in the poverty spectacle is not the effects of our consumption, but instead the poor whose lives can be saved by us. Who is the us? Those with the resources and power to sponsor a child, make a Kiva loan, donate a heifer, buy a pair of shoes so that a second pair can be given to those who are barefoot. This too is consumption. And this consumption is a relationship, at once intimate and distant, between benevolence and need, between donor and recipient. Where does this relationship take place? Increasingly in our everyday act of shopping. And thus my question to you, can we shop to end poverty? Each week, I shop for groceries at a fancy store in Berkeley. You know the type. Fair trade goodies, organic produce, sky-high prices. Each week, I fill my grocery cart with organic peppery arugula, delicate mushrooms, and luscious fruit. Yes, I'm a foodie. And each week, the act of grocery shopping becomes the opportunity to do good. I can add $5 to my grocery bill to empower poor women a continent away. I can donate to end world hunger. I can make poverty history, quickly, conveniently, as I shop. I'm no longer just a consumer. I am now a micro-philanthropist. Let me share a confession with you. I like this feeling. I like to make micro-donations. I like to feel that these donations have an impact on poverty and that these impacts can be measured and tallied and printed on the side of recyclable grocery bags. I like the feeling. Other types of shopping also engender poverty action. Take, for example, ethical consumerism and the case of the Red campaign. Founded by U2 rock star Bono. You thought I was going to do a video without mentioning Bono? Red is premised on a simple idea. What we choose to do or even buy can affect someone's life on the other side of the world. Buy a Red product, a Dr. Dre Beats headphone, an iPod, a Converse shoe, a t-shirt, and the manufacturer makes a donation to the Global Fund, which fights disease in Africa. There is something incredibly empowering about this idea, that our purchasing power can aid someone on the other side of the world. And there is something incredibly arrogant about this idea. Who are we to save lives, to give aid? So now you know a little bit more about me. You know that in addition to living in public housing, I'm a foodie, and yes, I have a crush on aging rock stars. Well, we know Bono's ageless, but what I hope this clip has conveyed is the energy and complexity of the age of poverty. That poverty has become familiar to us, but what is it that we know about that smiling child we can sponsor through a micro-donation? That smiling woman micro-entrepreneur we can empower through a micro-loan? I'm arguing that we have to unknow this familiar poverty, and that to do so, we need a different process of knowing poverty. So let me share with you how I came to unknow poverty. Many years ago, I set out to write my first book. For my research, I returned home to Calcutta, India. Calcutta, a city of 13 million, is understood as a city of slums, a place of poverty and despair. It's how we understand many cities in the third world, in the global south. But my life growing up in Calcutta had been a middle-class one, with limited encounters with poverty. Returning, there was no easy way to study poverty, no shortcuts. For a year and more, I traced how squatters and slum dwellers struggled to find shelter in the liminal spaces of the city, along railway tracks and polluted water canals. I followed tireless women as they packed the local trains on a daily commute against hunger from village to city. They worked as maids for the city's middle classes, who had come to call them the automatic washing machines. Toward the end of my research, one evening, I followed a high-ranking politician to a squatter settlement. It was a place I knew well, but I wanted to understand how he, running for electoral office, was going to conduct his campaign. After all, India is the world's largest democracy, and the poor are, if nothing else, active voters. But I did not know what was in store for me that evening. Once the crowds had gathered, he started his speech thus. She is a visitor from America, the richest country in the world, a country on whose aid the entire world survives. Knowing that many of the women in the settlement worked as maids, he turned to me and asked, "How much is a maid's salary in America?" I stuttered and tried to explain that I didn't employ a maid, but he thundered on, "Well, it must be at least $500 a month." And then singling out a young woman in the crowd, he asked, "You work as a maid, don't you? How much is your salary?" 400 rupees came the quiet answer, which at that time was about $13. He said, "Well, if you worked for her in her country, you would make 40 times that amount. Imagine that." As he spoke, I felt an unbridgeable gap open up between my life and the poverty of the residents of that settlement. For all my time in that community, I was suddenly nothing more than a visitor from America. And then a group of young men, perhaps sensing my discomfort, struck up a conversation with me. One of them, Ranjan, a lanky 20-year-old with sparkling eyes, asked, "I've heard that there are lots of homeless in America. How is this the case? Why doesn't the government simply allow them to take over vacant land like we have? Aren't they citizens? Don't they have rights?" In the face of all my explanations, Ranjan insisted, if one is a citizen, one can't be homeless. Poverty is a relational concept. The poverty I had measured and mapped in Calcutta was horrific in relation to my middle-class life and in relation to world standards of human well-being. But Ranjan felt that he was better off in his squatter shack than the shelter-searching, shopping cart-pushing, homeless men and women who struggle in the shadow of the Golden Gate. He insisted that while he was poor, he was not homeless. Now, I don't want to romanticize Ranjan's poverty. Exactly 10 days after our encounter, he and 2,500 other squatter families were brutally evicted from the settlement in which they had lived for 12 years. I never met Ranjan again. But I present Ranjan's story to you today as an allegory for how we can unknow our commonly held assumptions about poverty and why that may be important. Now, of course, to hear Ranjan, I had to be there. I had to be there in a messiness that does not find its way into the sanitized encounters with poverty on web portals, at grocery stores, in global citizenship campaigns. And it wasn't just that I was there to hear Ranjan, it is that he was speaking back to my frames of knowing poverty. There are at least 3 ways in which Ranjan's story matters. First, Ranjan asks a third world question of the first world. So much of the apparatus of development, from powerful institutions like the World Bank to global poverty campaigns, looks at the global south from the perspective of the global north. Ranjan turns that gaze around, and he sees at the heart of the world's wealthiest country, poverty. He marks the limits of American democracy by insisting that if one is a citizen, one can't be homeless. I like to recite Ranjan's story each year to the quite large class on global poverty that I teach here at Cal. I do so because my students belong to a can-do generation of socially conscious millennials who want to catalyze change, who want to undertake poverty action. Central to their ethics of global citizenship is a sense of responsibility towards what feminist geographer Doreen Massey has called spatially distant neighbors. But millennials who have a deep empathy for poverty on a distant continent are often less keen to know the poverty that exists at home. They want to volunteer in the slums of India, but they squirm at their encounter with the homeless panhandler on the streets of the liberal city of Berkeley. In other words, while poverty in the third world seems familiar, poverty at home, in proximity, seems strange, unknowable. Ranjan's question about the homeless in America is a prompt to have us think not only about spatially distant neighbors, but also about spatially proximate strangers, the poor at home we have rendered foreign through our ways of knowing poverty. Second, Ranjan explodes the boundaries of poverty expertise. Our knowledge of poverty is mediated by experts. Ranjan presents his knowledge as expertise, and we must understand it as such. In fact, Ranjan presents not just an analysis of his life, his circumstances, it is a global point of view. He reminds us that it is not only us, middle-class researchers, socially conscious millennials, who know poverty on a global scale, so do the poor. Third, Ranjan's question returns us to my opening argument about dependency. That squatter settlement Ranjan lived in was demolished by the government. What remained untouched were the neighboring gated enclaves of the middle classes and wealthy. They were as illegal as any slum, built on protected wetlands and agricultural land in defiance of municipal law, but they were not touched. In fact, the illegalities of the rich, and that's what they are, the illegalities of the rich, were celebrated as examples of economic growth and market-driven development. The always snarky and smart William Easterly, in his influential critique of foreign aid, The White Man's Burden, has this line: "The rich have markets, the poor have bureaucrats." On this one, Easterly's wrong, very wrong. The rich have state help, the poor have self-help. The rich have state help, the poor have self-help. Ranjan's insistence on framing the question of poverty as the question of rights reminds us of the tremendous inequalities of dependency, of state help versus self-help. To unknow poverty is to make a shift from asking how we can help the poor, to asking how poverty is produced, to asking how wealth, power, and privilege are maintained. To unknow poverty is to make a shift from tinkering with the charity that can do good to transforming the policies that enable wealth but impoverish poverty. To unknow poverty is to find the impossible space of poverty action. It is an impossible space between two extremes. On the one hand, the hubris of benevolence. We can end poverty while volunteering during spring break. We can end poverty while we shop for groceries. And on the other hand, the paralysis of cynicism. We cannot catalyze change in a world of profound inequality. I'm an educator, and so I must end not with my own words, but with the words of one of my students. For my students teach me as Ranjan taught me. The video that I shared comes from the Global POV project here at Berkeley, which involves two brilliant Cal alumna, Tara Graham and Abby Van Musen. The logo comes from an entry in Abby's notebook from my global poverty class a couple of years ago. It was a day when we were debating Thomas Friedman's depiction of the world as flat. Here is what Abby wrote.
And all this time, I thought the world was round. The world is not round. It has edges we can fall from and faces staring in entirely different directions. And I thought the world was huge, but it is not. It's in our hands. We can hold it, change it, turn it, shake it. We can solve it. But not by sheer luck or chance. We must be topped away.
Thank you.